Well, thanks for joining. We're going to continue the discussion of how we can utilize physics and physiology here in terms of getting our responses within the gym. Looking at a question that was asked off of the previous discussion. Since force equals mass times acceleration, and we know that the mechanical tension and force is the stimulus for growth, can we voluntarily and maximally accelerate our arm in order to grow muscle? Meaning if the force is high because acceleration is maximal, are we able to generate maximal growth simply from the mass of the limb we're trying to accelerate? It's a very interesting question. It's a very interesting question because it's going to look at two distinct factors that come into play as it relates to muscle growth, as well as the stimulation that we see within the exercise responses.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
And so when we start looking at this, we're really looking at is how do we go about addressing some of the messages that we might see as it relates to muscle contractions and the ability to generate hypertrophy, the ability to generate muscle growth. And it really goes into a couple of concepts and a couple of misconceptions and misconceptions that are out there as it relates to what's going to trigger muscle growth. But before we go on, there's a couple of things we have to address.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
And part of it has to deal with some terminology issues. And so we saw previously they're talking about fast twitch and slow twitch. But what does fast twitch and slow twitch really mean? Fast twitch and slow twitch is really referencing how do the muscles go about the contraction pattern once they get recruited. And so when we start looking at fast twitch and slow twitch, we're really talking about is how is the motor neuron and how is the brain connected to the neurons that are going to be connected to the muscles going to go about recruiting the muscle in order to do its contraction, in which we have a proportionality between how quickly the neurons can recruit the muscle, how quickly can the muscle undergo its depolarization, and how quickly can that depolarization lead to a release of calcium into the muscle to allow for a contraction to take place. All this is based off of Henneman's size principle and the relationship between how quickly do membrane potentials change, the size of signal necessary to get that potential to change, as well as how much calcium is available to interact with the regulatory proteins to allow for contraction to take place, along with the twitch speed that the myosin head is able to move at. And so we look at fast twitch and slow twitch, what we're really looking at how do we go about the movement of ions around the muscle, how quickly do the movements of the ions around the muscles regulate the regulatory proteins, that's how quickly are we able to unblock the myosin from the actin, and then how quickly can that myosin do its contraction, where fast twitch is able to do this much quicker than slow twitch, even though it's not that much different in terms of the overall speed at which we go about with the contractions we'll take a look at as we go through this. But then we also have to worry about some physics that comes into play, and particularly some physics terms that come into play. And so we talked previously about force. Force equals mass times acceleration. But we're really looking at terms of the kinematics of motion, which is what the question is asking about, is really angular force, inertia. And that is how quickly am I able to do my angular acceleration, the change of angle at the joint, relative to the mass that I'm moving. When we start looking at overload, which is what's going to trigger the growth within the muscle, we look at it based off of the force, the actual load, the mass times the acceleration that's being asked to move, as well as the work that's being done, in which we will have overload based off of mechanical load coming in the mass that's being moved, And the work overload, that is how much movement is taking place. And how long is that movement taking place? Here we're going to be looking at work based off of torque, because once again, we're not going to be linearly moving, we're going to be angularly moving. And this is where we have to look at not just how much load is being asked to move, how quickly is that load being asked to move, but also how long is that lever arm coming into play. And this is going to relate directly into the power output. And the power output is how quickly is that work being applied. And this goes into the lever systems and the type of mechanical advantages that we're going to get from the various lever systems. And the fact that our third class lever system is a high power lever system, but a low force lever system, a low strength lever system. We start looking at how muscles are functioning. Muscles are going to be able to provide tensile strength based off of the cross-sectional area and its ability to resist tearing. And so when I start to lift weights, when I start to go to the gym and exercise, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to provide a yield load that's going to cause mechanical damage to the muscle, that in response to the mechanical advantage, I'm going to increase the cross-sectional area so that I'm able to increase the tensile strength available within the muscle. And so when we start looking at the question in terms of the speed of contraction, we have to look at, okay, what is the difference in the kinematics of contraction? That is the differences in the concentric, eccentric, and isometric phases of the movement relative to the speed at which I can move and the relative force that I'm able to generate from the movement in the form of torque. And so what we do know is there is what's referred to as the force velocity curve. And the force velocity curve is going to directly relate to how quickly is the acceleration occurring. So what we have to remember is that acceleration is simply the change in velocity relative to time. And so if we look at the torque vectors that are available based off of the concentric, isometric, and eccentric motions that take place in this force velocity curve, we end up getting what's referred to as a double hyperbolic curvature. We get an S curve that takes place. And this S curve that takes place based off of what is summarized in Armstrong and in Alcazar's papers is a change of about 48% plus a little bit above the isometric maximal strength in our normal force velocity curves. And our normal force velocity curves is based off of the shrinking, the concentric motion, or the lengthening, the eccentric motion, and the amount of torque that's available to be produced based off of the shrinking, the concentric, or the lengthening, the eccentric. Because of the kinematics of contraction, because of the way in which the contraction is taking place, both the muscle contraction as well as the movement within the kinematic chain, concentric motion will always be moving against a load that is lower than the isometric maximum. Whereas eccentric motion, lengthening motion, will always take place against a greater than isometric contraction. And it's going to be temporary based off of what is the load that's occurring. However, I do know that on a maximal eccentric load, I'm going to exceed the isometric maximum, but I'm going to be moving the slowest, even though I might intend to move very quickly in order to slow or break the motion taking place. And so even though the weight or the limb is moving relatively slowly, the contraction speed can be quite quick in the eccentric phase. So even though we think about the eccentric phase as a relaxing of the contraction, we're not really relaxing the contraction. What we're doing is we're breaking or slowing down the motion in that kinematic part of the contraction phase. This slowing, because I'm able to get both passive and active strength coming from the muscle, I'm able to get greater than what I can get just from the active contraction that we see within the isometric contraction. And so it goes back to the question, can I maximally accelerate in order to generate force? Yes. Will that maximum acceleration lead to hypertrophication? Yes, within a caveat. We have to have some degree of overload within that muscle in order to generate a signaling in order to get growth. We can get it by maximally accelerating. And that maximum acceleration will be both on the concentric side as well as on the eccentric side. Because we're going to get maximal positive acceleration and then maximal negative acceleration, which we call deceleration. And so as long as I'm just flailing my limbs around in terms of trying to generate overload to get growth, as long as I'm controlling that downward motion, even if I'm not slowing as fast as possible, I'm going to be able to get the motion that is necessary in order to generate the growth that is being looked for. When we start looking at this in terms of that contraction phase, we also talk about the kinematic chain, the linking of all of the joints and all of the muscles is going to allow for motion to take place, and how all of the joints and all the muscles are going to link together to allow for motion to take place, where we cannot stipulate that we're going to get growth just within one muscle, within all of the muscles of the kinematic chain. This is where I see reports of, oh, the anterior chain and the posterior chain. We can't really look at motions in terms of anterior and posterior chains. We have to look at it in terms of flexion chains and extension chains, more than looking at it in terms of anterior chains and posterior chains. Because we're really looking at is we're looking, okay, how do all the muscles, the bones, and the joints line up to allow me to do motions, not necessarily where are they at relative to the body. Along with the kinematic chain and the joints being laid out, we also remember our lines of pull and the fact that we're trying to maximize both the X and the Y components of the force vectors, along with the stabilization in the Z plane, if we're looking at trying to do whole body motions in order to generate growth factors, in order to generate muscle growth, in order to generate bone growth, in order to generate tendon growth, in order to generate ligament growth. It's all going to be based off of how are the kinematic chain variables, how are all of the links in the kinematic chain lined up to allow for the maximization of that angle change within the lines of pull based off of both the fascicle arrangement within the muscle itself, the pennation, the parallel versus unipinnate versus bipinnate versus multipinnate versus convergent muscle, as well as how much hypertrophication, how much growth is taking place within the muscle fiber itself, that's going to allow me to maximize that X and Y angle changes so that I get both the sine and cosine additive factors within the muscle contraction itself. With the muscle contraction, with the line of pull, we also have to remember the lever systems that are going to come into play in terms of the muscle actions. They're going to generate the motions, whether it's a first class, a second class, or a third class lever system, and the relative mechanical advantages and disadvantages relative to each other that we see between third, second, and first class, where the second class lever, because of the differences in lever arms, will have the greatest mechanical advantage, which is going to get the greatest return of strength for strength put in relative to either that first class or that third class lever. Whereas the third class lever, because the load arm is always longer than the muscle arm, will get the least amount of mechanical advantage coming back to it. It's unable to generate a high level of force relative to the second or first, but is able to generate the greatest amount of power out of all of the lever systems, which means that when we start looking, okay, how am I going to generate hypertrophication? Within this third class lever system, I can, as we stated the other day, use my sticking points where I get the least amount of mechanical advantage as an isometric state or as an eccentric state in order to induce greatest amounts of hypertrophication based off of overload due to mechanical load. But at the same time, I can use this third class lever system, which is going to give me, once again, the greatest amount of power return to move rapidly within the contraction phases so as to increase training volume and increase mechanical damage taking place within the muscle. That mechanical damage that's taking place within the muscle is what's going to generate the overload response that we see within the muscle to cause hypertrophication. And so we have to remember that when we start looking at, okay, how am I going to be able to generate overload? Overload obviously is either going to be generated by working into fatigue, having a greater workload than what the muscle is able to do, or mechanical overload, having the muscle have to move against a larger load than what the muscle is able to move by itself. And this is where we start getting some mixed up messaging coming into play as relates to, do I do a fast contraction or a slow contraction in the exercise in terms of, am I going to be able to generate the greatest amount of hypertrophication taking place? Part of it is this misnomer about fast twitch and slow twitch. Part of this is the misnomer about load and time under tension and the ability to generate hypertrophication growth simply from time under tension. And so where are we getting wrong with these muscles? Well, it goes back to a little bit with that fast twitch, slow twitch. And what we understand is that we get this change in muscle fiber type based off of the recruitment that we get, and how the recruitment that we get is going to dictate what type of overall responses we see within the fiber, in which we have this pattern of recruitment based off of Henneman's size principle, where the slowest fibers are the smallest fibers and will be recruited first and will always be recruited. And the larger fibers are the fast twitch fibers that tend to only get recruited when we reach higher demand points within the muscle. And so what we see with Glocken, what we see with Lensko's reports, is that we get this transition between fiber types, where fiber type 1 is going to transition between the various types of fiber type 1, where fiber type 2 is going to transition between the various types of fiber type 2, based off of use and disuse of those fiber types, relative to the mechanical loads being required of them to work against. The speed at which the twitches occur allow for the type 1 fibers, the slow twitch fibers, put quotes around that. The slow twitch fibers will be recruited and will undergo their twitching, their contraction phase, at the point at which the fast twitch fibers have started to contract if the demand is high enough. And so, if I'm moving as fast as I possibly can, I'm going to be recruiting from the slow twitch all the way to the fast twitch. And the speed at which I move is going to be dependent upon the load I'm being asked to move against. Which means that if I'm going to just move my arm in order to generate overload, I have to do it to the point of excessive fatigue because I don't have a high load I'm moving against. But those big fiber types are going to fatigue faster than the small fiber types, which means that I can move my arm and just my arms in order to generate mechanical overload. But it's going to take a longer period of time to do it, even if I'm moving as fast as I possibly can with no external load, than if I was to move against some external load. And this goes into some of the other things that we see in terms of responses to training based off of the velocity or the tempo of the contractions. If we start looking at what Lopes tells us and what Wilk tells us in terms of their findings, the faster I contract, the more mechanical damage I do to the muscle, the faster the muscle fatigues in terms of neuromuscular fatigue, and a higher training volume is able to be used. I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive that if I'm going to fatigue faster, I'm not going to be able to train for longer periods of time. But if we look at what Lopes was doing in terms of their contractions, they were doing a contraction that was 1/4 the time that we see for normal contractions. And so they had a slow group and they had a fast group. And the fast group was moving in about a second per contraction, whereas the slow group was moving in between 5 and 6 seconds per contraction, which is the normal quote unquote tempo training. The faster contraction groups had greater mechanical damage and a greater training volume and had greater hypertrophication than the slower training. But the faster training group fatigued faster, they lost strength at a faster rate than the slow training group. If we take this and combine it with what Travis shows in terms of the emphasis of task-specific training, because we're training in third-class levers to move as fast as possible, even against excessively heavy loads, if I train at specific speeds that are necessary to carry over to what I'm planning on doing in an athletic event or in a real life event, I'm going to be able to maximally accelerate in order to match what is necessary in that real world situation. And when I do that, I get greater strength and greater power outcomes, and greater strength and greater power changes that will correspond with a higher degree of hypertrophication of the tissues. Now, there's other people, not referenced here, that come into play as relates to intended speed of movement. And I have an old advisor from grad school who basically said, everybody is intending to move as fast as possible, even if the load that's being placed on them doesn't allow them to move as fast as possible. And it goes back to what we're talking about in terms of that force velocity curve and the eccentric, isometric, concentric phases and the intended torque that is being produced based off of the speed at which I'm lengthening or shrinking that muscle. If I'm sending a signal down through my neurons to move as fast as possible, I need that fast neuron moving, which means I have to use the larger neurons, which is going to recruit the larger muscle fibers in order to move as fast as possible. As a consequence of that, I'm also going to be sending signals to the smaller neurons and the smaller muscles in order to get that same amount of recruitment. Which means that when I'm recruiting to move as fast as possible, I'm going to be recruiting slow and fast twitch equally in terms of the total amount of recruitment in order to generate the contractions necessary in order to generate the motion. That is going to be the signals necessary in order to get the mechanical overload damage and the workload overload damage to trigger hypertrophication and to trigger said principal responses within the muscle that over time will allow for muscle growth to take place. So this whole idea is quite complex. I understand it's quite complex. Hopefully I addressed some of the questions that was being asked. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you got a little bit out of what was being presented here. Please make sure you have subscribed. Please make sure you're sharing out. Click that bell to get alerts for when we post new things. Get that 5-star rating that you can give on the podcast, as well as here on YouTube. Click that like button. Make sure you are sharing out with what we're doing and following on all of the various platforms that we're publishing on.